Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Natalie Himmelrich. Today on the podcast I'm speaking with Sarah Stillman, who suffered preeclampsia and concealed placental abruption, which led to the stillbirth of her first son. Having been sexually assaulted earlier on in her life in a medical environment, she was very clear about needing to take charge of her medical care to avoid further traumatisation. Unfortunately, due to the developments in her pregnancy, it led to emergency care, which then resulted in experiencing even more trauma. Although her son Nathaniel died, Sarah says,
and wanted to make sure that we were there in his final moments. And all I could say when I look back at the photographs, that I've never been more at peace. I've never been more present. I've never been more, I just want to say myself, than when I was holding him.
We had such a rich conversation that this became a double episode. So this is actually episode 2. Or part 2 of our conversation. If you haven't listened to the first part, go back to episode number 34 and start there. About this week's guest. Sarah is one of Nathaniel's 2 moms. Yes, he has 2 moms. Nathaniel is Sarah and Amy's firstborn son, conceived through IVF with a traumatic ending in severe early onset of preeclampsia, placental abruption, emergency C-section and a brief NICU stay, and the death within his mother's arms. Sarah took to grieving, finding out what happened and planning for future pregnancy like a full-time job, and, in the midst of the uncertainty and haze of grief, identified resources that helped answer critical questions. In honor of her son, she created whenmybabydied.com, which aims to offer families a centralised resource hub of information and answers for the question no parent ever thought they'd have to find. Sarah is currently pregnant with Nathaniel's sibling, who is expected to be born in April 2023. She lives with her wife, 2 dogs, and Nathaniel's warrior spirit in central Massachusetts. Make sure to check out Sarah's link, When My Baby Died, which you can find in the show notes. So a lot of people that I've been working with will want to have me ask this question, like, because pregnancy after loss is one of the topics here, right? And the question that I get asked all the time is, when and how will I know that I'm ready again? Like, I just have one client in mind who's just actually lost her baby a week prior to me talking to her for the first time. And she said, I have this urge to have another baby. And I don't think I can, but I have this urge. And it's beautiful that she was able to speak out that urge, that desire. But also she saw, but I'm also grieving and needing to grieve. What am I doing with this? And so I'm asking you this question because a lot of people have that in their mind and probably have very exclusive people that they are allowing themselves to speak with about it.
Yeah. So I have to say, I felt the exact same urge. I think it's like 100%, natural, right? We expected to have this baby that we could have in our arms and be sleep deprived with. And when that baby isn't there, or babies, it's shocking to the system. I remember in those early days, I said, to my, the first 24 hours, I was like, I'm never getting pregnant again. But within 72 hours, I said to myself, if I get pregnant again. And then within the first week, it was when I got pregnant again, right?
And then when can I get pregnant again?
Yeah, right. Yeah. It was just sort of, and I remember thinking to myself, it's crazy how quickly I've changed. And my wife was like, this is insane. Like, you're like, we need a break. Like, we can't do this quite yet. So for me, I had that aching arm syndrome.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So I just wanted to mention that because I think that was the thing that really surprised me the most, was just, I had this experience in my arms. I just needed to hold something.
Yeah.
So
let me say a little bit more about that while you think, because I think that's important for people to hear, because for people who haven't experienced that, that sounds really strange, but it is really biologically true that women who have been pregnant and don't have a baby, that is stillbirth or pregnancy loss. And I think the biological urge gets stronger the later the pregnancy has been lost, or in a case of a stillbirth. But there is this biological urge, the same way as the biology goes on to make milk, even if you had a stillbirth, or the things happen in the way as if you had a child, that your body doesn't know the baby is dead. Your body goes on about, okay, so where's the baby? And there's this urge of, what's going on? I need to be home. I need to feed the baby. This is very biologically normal. Yeah. So the aching arm syndromes, that sounds like a strange term for someone who doesn't know it, but it is an absolute biologically normal situation to have that. I want people to hear that.
Yeah, definitely. So I would wrap up his urn in a blanket. I ended up getting this sort of like pillow that was the same length that he was. And it was very helpful, and then I didn't end up needing it after a while, but for those moments, it was the best thing that I could do to honor that need.
Yeah, and there's also these bears that are made in the weight of your baby, the weighted bears. I don't know if you know them.
Yeah, there's I didn't end up getting a weighted bear, but I know a lot of people who did.
Yeah. And that's actually also, I will mention here, but it's actually really a soothing way for bereaved parents or mothers specifically to deal with that physical situation. Like for me, I had Bears of Hope that are common in Australia. That's a foundation there that we have purchased some bears which also go to bereaved parents. And I would sleep with that bear. It wasn't a weighted bear, but for me, Amaya's middle name is Hope. So this was very apt for me. And I had a baby. So to say, for me, that was a different kind of scenario.
Yeah. So to get back to your question though, of like, how did we know that we were ready? Well, I think that there are a few different pieces. So one is medically, I wasn't ready. I was not cleared nor recommended to get pregnant for at least 6 months. We had other people that recommended a year. So I knew getting pregnant was off the table for a while. And because of that, I think it was helpful. It didn't stop the urge, but it was helpful to know not right now. That being said, I did have this 6-month mark in my brain of, I just need to make it to 6 months. So then there was, sort of a getting ready for pregnancy piece of like readying my body, making sure that I was healthy enough, looking at preeclampsia research and understanding and talking with experts around like what happened with Nathaniel. Is there a way that I can, and what could I do to potentially prevent this, or support this not happening again? And so putting a lot of those sort of pieces of research and expert opinions into place, which took months. Part of it was starting medications early. So there was all of these pieces that I really needed to focus on to make sure that that was actually in place. But I think the biggest and most important part, as one could suggest, was actually knowing emotionally when I was going to be ready. And I've tried to explain this to a few different people. One was the knowledge and the acceptance that any baby that would come from another pregnancy was not going to be Nathaniel, and actually being okay with that. The other part was knowing that, was knowing that I couldn't treat, or I didn't want to treat this baby as Nathaniel, and wouldn't want to put the pressure on that child to live up to or replace his sibling. So there was a lot of making sure that, like, as a parent, I was able to sort of separate who this baby would be or could be from who Nathaniel was and the trauma of that experience. The other piece is that I had to make sure that Amy was open to it. I had gone through a lot of trauma, and even if I was ready, I wanted to make sure that she was even able to begin to think about it. And I'm sure that she could have actually waited longer than we did. But I'm a little bit of a bull in a china shop when I get my mind set to something. So, we sort of moved on ahead, even though I was ready. I'm not sure she was 100% ready. So in hindsight, maybe we should have waited a little bit longer.
So with what you've shared already about knowing for yourself when you would be ready again to be pregnant after your loss of Nathaniel, what would you want others who are maybe at the same point in their life to think about pregnancy again? What would you want them to know from your experience?
So I would want them to know a few different things. One is there's never a perfect time. The same way there's never a perfect time to start having a family, there's never a perfect time to start trying again. There are going to be indicators that, it might be healthier for you to start X, Y, or Z time. But sometimes you just have to take that leap of faith. And once you may find yourself in that space, it's really hard. Trying to conceive after loss as well as pregnancy after loss, it is not for the faint of heart. And so being gentle with yourself, being gentle with your partner. All I can say is as much communication as you can have with yourself, as much support as you can bring. For me, I cannot underscore the benefits of having a really skilled grief counselor who specializes in child and infant loss in particular. It can make such a world of difference. So that's like one piece that I think has been and will continue to be a core part of my healing and journey. So that's what I would sort of highlight for folks is it's not easy. This is not an easy journey, and there's no guarantee, right, in pregnancy after loss that this one will not also end in a loss.
Exactly. Yeah.
But, sometimes you just have to take that leap of faith and make sure you do it with as much love and support for yourself as well as your body and your partnership as you can.
So, Sarah, I want to circle back to something you said at the beginning when you were talking about your story of grief and trauma. And you mentioned the sexual assault or the incidents of sexual assault that you had. And then you also mentioned it again during the birth story of Nathaniel and what happened there, where you said, okay, well, this is going to be traumatic. I need to look at that. And it's a really tough subject for many people who have experienced it. And I would love to delve a little bit more into this topic. Would that be okay for you?
Yeah, definitely. I think that so much of who I am now is around like the grief and trauma of child loss and pregnancy loss and childbirth. But if you had talked to me a little over a year ago, it would have been as someone who was a survivor of sexual assault. And so my history around this is complex, and in particular, the main sort of incident was around what I'm going to call medical rape that was caused by a doctor. And so I think in particular, birth is an extremely open, it's an extremely vulnerable time. Pregnancy is an extremely vulnerable time. It can also be empowering. But I was really nervous about needing to go into a medical facility and utilizing different medical care, where we know that the history of OBGYN care is very focused on, or has been dominated a lot by men and sort of whatever they came up with, at least in the US in the 50s, and is not necessarily holistic and thoughtful about, the woman's body and what's comfortable and those kinds of things. So for me, working on that, and making sure that I had a plan around that was going to be really critical to make sure that I was approaching my pregnancy as healthily as I could.
Okay. So I need to ask a clarifying question, because I'm wondering in my head, what do you mean by medical rape?
It's a term that I think was the best way that I could describe it, where a procedure was done not fully with my consent, and was continued even after I said stop, to a part of my body that, I think, one often associates with different forms of sexual assault. And it seemed that ultimately, the doctor, for lack of a better term, found it enjoyable for themselves, despite being in pain.
Okay.
I think that it's a very unique situation, and one that, given some prior experiences, I had this incident of stalking in like a professional setting. I had this incident back in high school around needing to like get out of a room where a guy had sort of cornered me. It had all just sort of built, and was extremely hard in the way of, I felt like I had started to lose my agency and my personhood, and there was deep fear there. So that's sort of there was a series, I would say, of like culminating events that led to this point where I had a huge distrust in care, and then who was going to be providing me that care. And so when I entered into my pregnancy, it was really critical for me to build a team that I felt comfortable with, which was largely women, and to begin to do some really critical advocacy work for myself in a hospital system known for, unfortunately, sort of like bulldozing through patients. And what I mean by that is, they're a large system. They have a way of doing things. And they were really just at the beginning of their trauma-informed care journey. And so really pushing and advocating for myself to have a trauma-informed plan that was going to be put in my record, that would flash up before, like, and everyone had to acknowledge it before, they could go in and view my chart. There was a lot of work that I needed to do around that, and also to sort of say stop when it wasn't being followed. So that was some of the initial work that I did when I initially got pregnant with Nathaniel.
And I think it's important to hear. I mean, you made some really, really powerful points there. I mean, you were in a place, given that you say that you were able to advocate for yourself. But then there was also places where you described where you were in a hospital and you were angry at being there, which makes complete sense given the history that you just shared, as well as then situation where you are now, okay, we have to give you a chance and the baby a chance, and then there's going to be this procedure, and then everything goes fast. And as we know, trauma is too fast, too much to be able to integrate it. So it leads to further, or can lead to further trauma if this is the necessity of survival. And what I like is to be mindful of all grief does not have to have trauma, but all trauma has some form of grief, because you're letting some part of you you're having to grieve that part that you no longer are, because that part of you has experienced something that before it didn't. Therefore, you see the world and feel the world and experience the world through different eyes, hands, body, heart, everything.
Yeah. I think in particular, the experience of the emergency C-section, right? It was so unplanned, which I think brings many folks back to, if you've experienced any form of sexual assault or abuse, the feeling of all that control being ripped out of your hands. Obviously I knew cerebrally it was being done for the safety of myself and the baby. But at the same point, I was not being told why there were hands between my legs, or that I was wearing a nightgown, that it was being like, I felt all of a sudden it was cut off, or, there were lots of things that I knew had to happen because it was an emergency situation, but it went exactly to all of these incredibly painful points and incredibly challenging points that I knew were just sort of adding a little bit extra flame to this fire that I had worked so hard to try to avoid and take care of. So even in that, right, there's this sadness, this guilt of, I just didn't do quite enough. And it still happened. So I think about that sometimes around how this event, birth, that I really had wanted to be a healing experience really was not. And coming to terms with that was its own kind of grief, as you had mentioned. There, in the trauma, there is grief.
Yeah. And so you mentioned that when you had this emergency C-section, you said to yourself, okay, this is traumatic and I have to do some work on that. What did you do to help you deal with that re-traumatization? For lack of a better word, I call it. I don't want to put words into your experience, but it sounds like a re-traumatization.
Yeah. So it was a fewfold. One is, I've been in therapy for a long time, even before Nathaniel. So, working on these pieces, and I remember thinking to myself, I'm going to need a lot of therapy on this. I'm going to talk about this. And so part of it was talking about it early on, and not trying to push it down, but bringing it forward. I mentioned it actually to my MFM, who wasn't there. And I said, this was really hard for me. I had made this whole plan with this trauma-informed care, and then all of a sudden that was gone. So initially, even bringing it up within 24 to 48 hours, I told my wife this was a really, really hard thing for me. And then talking about it in therapy, I did end up starting EDMR, which I'm not going to remember the exact, like the full name. It's like eye desensitization.
Yeah. Eye desensitization movement therapy.
So I had started with that. And it actually, for me, in the end, I felt like I had some of the skills that I needed from previous to sort of like work on that. And I didn't necessarily need the EMDR work. So that's not to say that other folks wouldn't find that form of therapy supportive, but talking it through, being able to sort of discuss and separate like what needed to happen versus what I had wanted to happen versus, was I actually safe? All of those pieces were conversations that I had with myself and with others that really helped to inform and bring down the intensity of that trauma. So it could have been re-traumatizing in like a full-blown way, but having handled it early on and in the way that I did for at least myself, it didn't necessarily feel like it added some big additional layer. I was able to really sort of shift and focus more on the grief and loss of Nathaniel.
So that is probably an answer to the question or the statement that you made before about had I not done enough for this to happen again? And what I hear from what you're sharing is that all the work that you had previously done on working on that trauma from before has enabled you to have agency and advocate for yourself and bring it up within 24 hours and bring it up to the surface as to not have that continue in your system to just stay there and have to be managed. So I think that is sometimes as good as it gets, given the circumstances.
Yeah, exactly. I think voicing it for myself was just going to be the most critical thing, to not have it hidden, to not feel the guilt around it.
Exactly.
As with many things, as I've described so far, meeting it head on. And I think one of the things that comes from child loss and infant loss, as I've talked with many moms about, is that you start to, really not give a damn. You're really strong in terms of standing next to your convictions because you have gone through some of the toughest things that people can ever go through.
Yeah. And, I liked the part where you described yourself when you held Nathaniel, when you said, I was never more present, never more myself. And you mentioned a couple of other things, but those two things, it's just, as you're telling this, I feel that these strands sort of follow on with us post-loss. I described myself as, before I was more people-pleasing and more socially digestible, whereas afterwards I wasn't, but I was more myself.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think the people-pleasing part of me was, not to say that I still don't try to do that, I do. But I would say the intensity of that, I really said goodbye to. And, it had long been like, why do I do this? Like, do I have to do this? And now that it's sort of dissipating, it's just like this freedom that it's like, that is like the true empowerment of like doing things and trying things that I never thought I would have ever done before. And I think that's the one of the, I don't know if there's something good that can come out of trauma and the work that you do around it. It's sort of this newfound freedom that I didn't even know was possible.
Well, that's where the term comes in, post-traumatic growth. And
I've actually never heard post-traumatic growth, but I love that.
So one thing maybe that we could use to bring this to a round end, because you haven't actually spoken about that, but part of the last year was also, and maybe that was part of mothering Nathaniel, you brought a whole new website to life based on your experience. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I sort of have described that the first 6 months was really sort of it was a grieving process and of looking at different resources and reading and investing and clarifying. And so part of what I did during that time was try to figure out what existed out there. Part of what existed out there is this wonderful Instagram community, and realize that there wasn't a place where all of these diverse organizations and supports and grief loss items to really help aid parents in their journey and making memories and honoring their children. There wasn't a place where, like, a one-stop shop. And I felt like for me, that was, I wanted something that would help to contribute in Nathaniel's honor, because for me, so much of what I had experienced was having a question, not sure where to go. And it was a lot of work. And if I wasn't the person that I was, it would be totally overwhelming. And I don't necessarily know if my grief journey would have been as meaningful and as healing. So I thought, let's put this together. And so in his honor, I put together a resource hub that I think really focuses on the practical, some of those key questions, especially in those early days, whether you've just received, the knowledge that your child has a fatal illness or diagnosis, or something like Nathaniel, or maybe you've had a stillbirth, and you are not quite sure what to do. So what do you do with your baby in those moments where you have to say goodbye and build all those memories? What do you do? How do you bury them? Where do you look? What are the cremation options, right? So starting to build a place that can help to answer those questions for folks, because we haven't thought about them usually.
Exactly.
And it's helpful to have someone put that together for you. It's one less thing on your plate. So that's sort of what the resource hub is. I will say I haven't worked on it as much as I have wanted to in the last handful of months now that I've been pregnant. But my hope is, on maternity leave, I'll be able to sort of invest some more time in it. And, I have so many ideas for growing the resource hub, which is called whenmybabydied.com. That I hope in, Nathaniel's memory to be able to continue to do that and do that for the families that have come before me, as well as will unfortunately come after.
That's fantastic. And the link will be in the show notes for people wanting to find it. So if someone had resources that they found useful, would they be able to add or give you suggestion? Is that also the way that this works?
Yeah, absolutely. So on the main homepage, there is a recommendation area. So you can shoot your recommendations in there. Or if you have questions of I'm looking for this resource, I don't see it. I can try to, put together some work on that. It really is supposed to be a resource by lost parents for lost parents.
Yeah.
I have put up resources that I have found helpful, but I'm just one person, and my journey is unique, and everyone's journey has their own sort of resources and things that they have found helpful. And so ultimately, while I do think it is a largely US focused resource hub right now, I would love to be able to build it more globally.
Yeah. And I'm sure that given the sharing here, will people be enticed to see what's out there, what helped them, and add to it. I mean, this is how I remember how we spoke first. And in 2015, actually, and I think I shared that with you, it was my sort of idea, my dream, a little bit more on a different angle, on the grief angle, to say, well, if people are grieving, and that was in relation to grieving parents as well, where do they go? How do they find the resources that are out there? So many people are doing fantastic things, but everyone is doing their own little beautiful thing to memorialize their child. And so that was my wish, to have the Google of grief, or Google for grieving parents. I mean, the Grieving Parents Network that I founded is a part of that, but a small part. But we'll definitely find a way to collaborate and put these things together. Because as you say, parents don't prepare for these kind of situations. And also, hopefully, they don't have to.
They don't
but
have
when
to,
they,
right.
When they have to, when it's there, then they can help. They can use all the help that they need. And if anyone here listens to that and knows someone later down the track who has that experience, you know where to go and look for it. Well, thank you, Sarah. This is going to be a beautiful interaction here on the podcast for people. And as you know, we're ending this segment now. This will be a longer segment with the rapid fire questions. Shall we do that?
Yeah, let's do that.
Grieving and trauma means?
An endless journey filled with energy that shouldn't be put off.
And healing means?
Finding a new expression of oneself in a long time. And it's similarly a long journey. It's never complete.
And what I have learned about myself in the light of loss and trauma?
I've survived, and I'm a lot stronger than I ever thought I would be.
Yeah. One thing I wish people knew about loss and trauma?
It's everywhere. I never knew how many people had lost their pregnancies, their babies, but everyone is impacted by this. Everyone knows someone. You just sometimes have to pull back the curtain.
And from your story, I'd like to add this question. What is one thing you wish people would know about the trauma of sexual assault?
It permeates every part of your life and, unfortunately, your identity. And it's not solely who you are.
And the last question, one specific thing that has changed since your loss and trauma that you wouldn't want to miss?
I think I'm a kinder, more empathetic, more straightforward person. I would not, given that I can't take back Nathaniel's death, I would not change the person that I've become. I think that this is who I was meant to be, and it feels really good to be now in this body.
Thank you, Sarah, for your openness and your willingness to be so vulnerable, also specifically with the topic of sexual assault, which is a first now on the podcast, and I like the fact that we were able to talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to my newsletter on nataliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Nathalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.